Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the FSR Insight series. The quarterly theme that we are discussing is securing Europe's energy future. And in today's second installment, we will explore the topic of climate justice and how to integrate fairness in climate scenario research to better inform policy making and practice. Presenting is co-author research exploring a proposed justice framework to address these complex implications and challenges. We have with us Kian Min-Soo, is a senior lecturer in the Department of Philosophy at the University College Cork. And he will be joined in the discussion by Philippe Delacoque. He's a senior researcher at the French National Research Institute for Agriculture, Food and Environment. Then we have Amaya Palencia Esteban. She's a research officer in the International Inequalities Institute at the London School of Economics. And we have also our own Jacopo Cameo from the FSR Climate. He's a research associate there. And then before I pass to our keynote, the floor to kickstart these events, I would like to remind our audience to feel free to engage with us and with our speakers through the Q&A chat box at any point during the session. My co-host, Nicola Rossetto, who's there with us, will get your questions in the second part of the debate. Now, without further ado, Kian, to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here, and thanks for FSR for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be addressing you all. So I'll share my slides there. So one thing to say about the slides is that I'm going to share the slides with the FSR Secretariat, and my understanding is they'll upload that online later, so you'll have access to these as well. I'm going to be discussing justice for climate researchers, and the goal here is to see how justice can be integrated into various kinds of climate work. And of course, as was just discussed, we're interested in regulation and we're interested in policy making. So the first thing to say, as with many of these things, is that I have many co-authors here that at the Integrated Assessment for International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IIASA, which is an institute in the south of Austria, Carolina Zim, Jarmo Kijkstra, Elena Brütchen, and many others. Okay, so to motivate this. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, in their 6th assessment report repeatedly stressed that modelers and climate researchers have difficulty when systematically incorporating justice considerations. So it's quite challenging for researchers and policymakers in general to systematically understand justice. So for instance, in the scenario building workshop in Bangkok last year, that was one of the specific outcomes. So you might think intuitively that we have various kinds of ways of addressing this. So we might talk about fairness, or we might talk about, as we often do in policymaking, especially climate policymaking, equity, or sometimes principles of equity. Now, I want to suggest that that's not going to do very much. Why not? Well, we might have intuitions about what kind of distributions are fair or what principles might be equitable, but they're not very fine-grained concepts. By that, I mean they don't have a lot of content that we can use to really distinguish things. If I say something feels fair and you say something feels unfair, it can be difficult for us to figure out why we disagree or what it is that's making us come to those different views. So, as usual, when there's trouble brewing, philosophers can and should come to the rescue. One of the things philosophers are trained to do is give very fine-grained, sometimes too fine-grained, but hopefully sometimes usefully fine-grained distinctions. We like to give definitions, we like to explain things and figure out exactly what can be going on. Okay, so in this context, when we're talking about justice, here's a few desiderata. We want our aspects of justice to be accessible, meaning we want it to be understandable to, say, policymakers as well as to natural scientists, but more generally to non-philosophers. We want it to be powerful in the sense that we want a small number of justice considerations to give us a large expressive power to be able to understand many different kinds of differences in justice views. And finally, we want our positions to be somewhat, or at least largely, modular. We want them to be separable in the sense that we want them to be independent. Okay, so that, if we can do all of that, then we have justice concepts and we have a justice framework that can contribute to certain kinds of dialogue, understanding the differences in justice positions, and diagnosis. Okay, so the work that this comes out of came out earlier this year. It's called Justice Considerations in Climate Research, and as before, it comes with many co-authors. And the goal of this project was to give a sense of a framework of these different justice considerations, and that's what I'm going to present today. So here's a diagram of the framework. Depending on how big your screen is, you might not be able to read these, but the idea is this row here at the top is the area of justice, what we're applying justice to. So in climate change, of course, it's standardly mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, but it can be other things as well. We can be talking about human well-being more broadly, or climate impacts. Of course, we could be talking about all kinds of other things like energy access as well. The scope of justice is who is considered. That's this gray row. So we have this top one, temporal scope, time, cohort. Sometimes we divide things into generations. Here, also very relevant to regulation, we might include discounting, how we include future impacts and how we weight them compared to current impacts. And then in the second row, we have spatial scope, global, where we're talking globally, we're talking regionally, nationally, at the EU level, subnational, etc. Then in this third row, which is the most important, we have the forms of justice. Now, again, depending on your screen, you might not be able to see this, but this first one breaks down into these bottom two rows. These bottom two rows belong to distributional form. So the 5 forms of justice we're interested in are distributional, procedural, corrective, recognitional, and transitional. And under distributional, we have the idea of the metric of justice, the thing that we are taking to be morally important and are that we're investigating or distributing. Standardly, we talk about welfare, but we don't have to only talk about that. We can talk about other things like health or nutrition or energy. And once we've got our metric of justice, we also talk about the pattern of justice, sometimes called the shape of justice. What is the way that would be ideally distributed? So we might have a utilitarian distribution, we might have an egalitarian distribution, but there are other ones as well. A sufficientarian distribution says everyone has to have at least some amount. A prioritarian says we add a concave transform that weights lower utility or lower welfare people more strongly. And libertarian says that it's morally important that certain people do not go above some level. Okay, so this is the framework, and the rest of the presentation, I'm just going to be giving more explanation of these different parts. So at the high level, we break justice into, as I said before, the scope, area, and form. Those are the first 3 rows. And form in the literature is sometimes called a type and sometimes called a dimension, even a pillar. Part of what we're doing with this is also mapping the terms together so that it's easy to understand what people are saying, even when they sometimes use inconsistent terminology. The area is the subject matter, the thing we're considering about justice. In the climate context, it's often mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, but it can be other things as well. The scope is who's considered, which again, you can imagine the temporal scope, which includes things like discounting and the size of cohorts, and spatial scope. One other thing about scope is who is considered might go beyond humans. So philosophers, especially Peter Singer, famously said we can imagine an expanding circle of considerability. We can start with the anthropocentric, which is including all and only humans, but we can expand. We can be sentientist. We can care about all beings that are capable of feeling pleasure and pain, or even broader than that, all living beings. Now, obviously, in most practical policy circumstances, we don't do these, but that could be considered if we were expanding the scope of who we cared about. And again, there are forms of justice. The focus here is on the ones that are most relevant to climate research, and of course, policy following that. But we're interested in distributional, procedural, recognitional, corrective, and transitional. And the reason these are selected, again, is because there's a relatively small number of them, but they give you a large amount of power, and they're modular. And this transitional in particular is new to the discussion. The other four are versions of things that are quite familiar to justice researchers, but the way I'm using transitional justice, importantly, is different than it's sometimes used in the law context, where it's about historical trauma and responding to historical trauma. This is a totally different use of the term. Okay, so the first one is distributional. As I said before, that breaks down into two sections. So first, we can imagine distributional justice as involving a metric, sometimes called a currency of justice, the thing we're taking to be morally important. And often it's proxied, at least in the scientific context, by some indicator. The indicator is not itself morally important. So for instance, calories we might measure, but we don't care about calories by themselves. We care about them because they're representative of health. Or consumption. Consumption is not morally important by itself. It's morally important. It's only important insofar as it contributes to something like welfare or utility. Then there are these shapes or patterns of justice. Again, as I mentioned before, there are several of them. We can think of egalitarianism, prioritarianism, and sufficientarianism as examples. And once we have a metric plus a pattern, we have something we call a distributional theory of justice. We can use this framework to better understand some of the policy equity principles that have been discussed. So for instance, we have equal per capita as a common idea, contraction and convergence, where countries converge to, say, the same emissions. These obviously are indicative of things like egalitarianism, whereas others, in the climate context, green development rights is an influential framework. We can think of that as sufficientarian. It's important people get to some minimal level, and it's less concerned about what happens above that level. You can see, hopefully, that these are quite powerful in the sense you can describe a whole bunch of principles, but also you can develop ones that haven't been discussed as much. Okay, procedural justice. So procedural justice involves how decision-making is done. In the philosophical literature, this is often discussed by political philosophers in terms of governance, but we can extend it to research as well. So in the research context, procedural justice, we think analogously to the governance context, involves what kinds of tools, models, and input data. In the governance context, procedural justice has to do with how we make our decisions, how stakeholders are consulted, how democratic we are, and so forth. But in the research context, we can add this interface between research and policy is also about procedural justice. How do scientists engage with policymakers, and vice versa? How do policymakers engage with scientists? What sort of questions are asked? What sort of risks are communicated? And what sort of limitations on data are communicated? Next, I'm going to discuss recognitional justice. So recognitional justice involved who is involved in the decision-making and how decision-making is sensitive to context. So this term, I should point out, is quite contested in the literature. So the way I'm going to describe it is a particular way of understanding it, but there's other ways that have been done. So in this context, in the research context, our view is that this has two main components. So on the one hand, the composition of researchers. Do we recognize different groups by having our research reflective of different kinds of, say, researchers, parts of the world, socioeconomic class, gender, nationality, etc. But also in implementation, and I think this might be especially interesting here, if we have a certain kind of a policy at the top-down level, that might be very sensible, but if we don't implement it with sensitivity to those facts on the ground and particular groups that are affected, then it's both not likely to work and it's likely to be recognitionally unjust. For instance, certain kinds of indigenous groups are going to have certain kinds of sensitivities and needs. Some groups, it's important that you go through trusted stakeholders. With other groups, it might be important that certain ways of life are respected and so forth. These are all various things that would fall for us under recognitional justice, those implementation questions about how they're sensitive to facts on the ground. Okay, corrective justice. The next form of justice is corrective justice. Now, corrective justice goes very far back in philosophy and involves addressing a past wrong. It's important for a corrective justice that there is wrong or wrongdoing. So it's not always the case. And in the climate context, it raises the question of whether we think emissions are wrongs. That's a difficult topic, which I'm happy to discuss. But if we do suppose that they're wrongs, then there's various kinds of corrective justice that might apply. An obvious thing is certain kinds of financial compensation, compensatory justice. But we might also expect to reset some kind of status quo ante, something restorative. Or we might require something which is not changing the situation, but acknowledging or recognizing that there was wrongdoing. And this is something we might call reparative justice or symbolic reparative justice. And one quick helpful distinction here for philosophers is the distinction between backwards-looking considerations and forward-looking considerations. Backward-looking considerations focus on the causal and historical connections. So, for example, holding polluters responsible, that's backward-looking. Forward-looking considerations ignore the causal history. They just look at how the world is or how it's going forward. So, for instance, if you're forward-looking, you might talk about dealing with climate change, whoever has the best ability to address it. And that's not thinking about how it was caused, but just today, who has the capacity, for example. Corrective justice, by definition, is purely backward-looking. It's always considering that causal history, whereas some of those other forms of justice do not. Okay, now the one that is newest to this discussion, we call transitional justice. So building on John Rawls and John Simmons, we use transitional justice to indicate the justice dynamics of temporal pathways. So this contrasts with distributional justice. So remember, distributional justice, you have two things. You have the thing you're measuring, the metric or currency, and you have the ideal pattern or shape of it, the amount you would want or how you would want it amongst a population. Notice that that's what we call static, meaning it's if you have a particular distribution, you can compare it to that and you would say, okay, well, how far or how close is it to that? Sometimes we call it an end state because we say it's the most ideal distribution. And the question is, does our current distribution look like that? How much or how little? Okay, so it's static. Transitional justice is going to be about the dynamics. So in the climate policy community, transitional justice predominantly applies in terms of what we call policy sequencing, which involves how we incorporate certain kinds of regulations or policies, and do we do it in a particular order in order to generate synergies. So for instance, when we're talking about carbon subsidies and carbon pricing, should we do it in a particular order in order to, again, generate efficiencies or synergies? And these are roughly questions of efficiency or efficacy. What we're going to talk about here is a new and more conceptually ambitious question about what we're calling a metaform of justice, because in some ways it governs other forms of justice, which is how to balance justice considerations and dynamics over time. So at the first level, we can consider the same form of justice and compare it. So for instance, if we have distributional justice, we can talk about, let's suppose we have some end state and we have a couple of pathways. One of those gets more equal, say for egalitarian, and the other one less equal. If the one that's more equal has to pass through a state that's less equal than now, is that permissible? Is it permissible in the short term to sacrifice distributive justice in order to get to a more distributionally just outcome? So that's a consideration or a trade-off within a particular form of justice. But even more ambitiously, we can consider trade-offs between forms of justice. Suppose in the short term, we have to do something that's procedurally or recognitionally unjust. Suppose, for instance, there is a vulnerable group, maybe an indigenous group or a socioeconomically vulnerable group, that if you were to somehow use their land in a way that is unjust, you would be able to build an energy grid that would benefit large amounts of the EU, and maybe even that group in the long term themselves. Would that be justified? In the short term, it would be doing something that's unjust, perhaps taking or using their land in ways that are taking advantage of their vulnerability. But in the long term, maybe there's very large benefits to a large group of people. Is that just? So that falls under, again, what we call transitional justice. And we think that transitional justice is especially important when we're talking about these sort of scenarios, when we're talking about pathways, and we're talking about long-term problems like climate change. So my time is almost up. So the goal here is to generate, again, a powerful, in the sense of being able to express many kinds of justice considerations, a modular, in the sense that these different forms of justice are at least largely independent, or you're able to select which ones are relevant to your particular case or regulation or situation, and accessible in the sense that hopefully when you're thinking about justice, you now have a whole bunch of concepts that you can use that will help you precisify exactly what you're interested in a given circumstance. We hope to build on this with what we call a JustMIP. A MIP is a model intercomparison project. These are very common in especially climate physics. So they have when to have various kinds of global models, they go through various systematic exercises to compare them. We're hoping to build on this project by comparing the justice considerations in different models. Notice that this can be used to elicit preferences over various ideal distributional patterns. We're in the process of building an app that'll help test stakeholder preferences over different shapes or patterns. We'll give them some different currencies or metrics of justice. So we might be talking about consumption, or we might be talking about health, and then see which kind of distribution they think is most just. We think that this is really valuable because it systematizes and translates philosophical research for an interdisciplinary climate audience, especially for potential and actual regulators. And we think that it's helpful because it makes these concepts accessible, but also it systematizes a lot of the discussions that are happening in this other discipline, which might be less accessible otherwise. And that leads to the final point, which is that we hope it provides useful concepts. We think that these concepts are important because they allow us to discuss more systematically and diagnose differences in justice intuitions for researchers and policymakers, and hopefully allows us to get to a deeper level of understanding. It doesn't tell us which forms of responses to justice are right, but what it does do is it allows us to have more understanding of what's going on when we disagree, hopefully. And with that, I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kian. Very insightful and very clear. So let's move right away to our discussants' reactions. Let's start with Philippe. Any input from your side?
Yes, thank you, Marcia, and thank you for the presentation. I was very happy to be invited to discuss this paper that is really interesting and not really in my area of expertise. So it's always interesting to look aside. So I'm an economist, so mostly my question and remarks will be related to my discipline, obviously. I think first that the entry point of the paper is quite interesting, meaning that, well, basically nobody will say I'm against justice. And so justice is somehow a mobilizing concept. Everyone agrees with it, but nobody has the same definition. So it's really important to build a framework like the authors do. So I have a few questions and comments. So as an economist, I will focus more probably on the distributive justice part, which is certainly more familiar to us. A first comment and comment question is in the first figure that was showed. I was wondering whether there would be something missing about the groups that are considered, because there is a scope, whether it is a local, national, or more global scope. But I guess that also the group and the type of populations that are concerned are particularly important. So do we talk about social classes, about gender, about age, race, religion? I guess it can be another module of this modular approach that was proposed by the authors. That's a first remark. And doing that, I would say that it can interplay with a special scope. Scale, you can be interested at the global scale and comparing between justice issues between countries, like between the North and the global South, for instance, or within countries, like the poor versus the rich, gender issues, etc. So maybe this other characteristics of such a framework would be interesting, and I'd be curious to hear the author about that. Another comment is that concerning the distributive justice part, utilitarianism is presented as a justice concept, while it is also said in the paper that it's more complicated than that. But as an economist, I wouldn't present utilitarianism as a justice concept, because for us, at least in our discipline, utilitarianism is really a matter of efficiency, and not at all a matter of justice, or even not distribution. Like, distribution doesn't really matter in utilitarianism. So maybe you could say that utilitarianism can bring some type of consideration about intertemporal, intergenerational distribution, but certainly not at the cross section level. So I'd be curious about that, to have the reaction of the authors about that. I will follow with another comment on recognitional justice, because I found it very, very interesting when applied to science, when it is said that basically science should cultivate diversity, and I fully agree with that point, and I think that it is very interesting. And I'm wondering how the author what the author would recommend to cultivate diversity. There is one particular point that I have in mind. It's the one of power of trends, right? When you have a trendy topic or a trendy methodology, basically everyone is pushed to apply it and to work on that type of topic. This is also related to the way science is funded, because basically if you want to gather fundings, basically you need to fit in the concept, in the methodologies, in the topic of interest of the time. And so sometimes I would say that the scientific system doesn't help you to cultivate diversity. So I would be curious to have the feedback of the author on that matter. I will.
Philippe, sorry. I'm gonna stop you here, because I think we have a lot of food for thoughts at the moment, and then I'll come back to you if we have still time for the rest.
Sure.
Of your talk.
So thanks.
Thank you very much. So maybe Kian, would you like to give a brief reply now, or you want to wait for the others?
I'll wait for the others and take them all. I'll take notes. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. So Amaya, what's your take?
Yes, sir. Thanks also for inviting me and for the very nice presentation. I believe that it's very insightful, and I would like to start saying that I fully agree with the framework and believe that it's very helpful. There is also often a lot of confusion when it comes to justice terminology. Like when you read in papers, you realize that sometimes we are referring to the same idea with different words, or the other way around, like different concepts with the same idea. So I think that you guys have been done a very nice work in terms of putting this framework and trying to classify and make it a bit easy and propose this guide. And I think that it's clear that we need a just transition, and hopefully there will be more research coming in this direction. So I think it's a good starting point. I have one question that is more of a curiosity thing. How did the framework start to be built? So what was the building block? Because here we see already all set up, but how did you start to classify things? I'd like to know if there was any dimension that you would have liked to include, but you thought that it would be too complicated to include, or there was not, agreement within the whole team. Also, I'd like to comment a bit on the scope side. So I like that today in the presentation, you stressed on this anthropocentric view. I would say that in the paper, it only, well, not only, there is some lines that you address this discussion at this point, and I really like reading it. And I'd like to know a bit more about your thought on how can justice climate, research that's focusing on justice climate overcome this anthropocentric view. If from the literature review that you perform, you see any study that's going in this direction. And also I'd like to say that although probably was not addressed in the talk today, I'd say that the paper was a bit provocative in a way, because at some point, especially at the end, you all authors come to basically challenge us all researchers in being a bit more honest with our methods and all the assumptions that we take, and explicitly making it clear what are we addressing in our papers, what are we leaving behind, and being clear on that. And I really liked reading it. I thought it was provocative in that sense, because we don't always come to realizing about that. I don't think it only applies to environmental economics or inequality economics. But just to finish with my points, I'm going to act a bit as the devil's advocate now. So it's a bit about, I want to hear about your thoughts on this. So obviously, we need to express what are the limitations, what are the assumptions that we're making. We all have judgments, and the tools and the methods that we apply are not free of this judgment. But when should we start making it clear in reporting, and what should we end? So I'm just thinking here, like one of the advancements that you propose is, for instance, in the distributional part, providing new metrics, and you mentioned the Gini. And then we can say, okay, so you take the Gini, but then why not a different index which has different properties, let's say TEL? So how could this fit into a world where we have to count words when it comes to publications, and in terms of justifying and discussing the limitations and assumptions? So just a bit the thoughts, because I really liked and enjoyed reading this, although it was not mentioned today in the presentation. That's it from my side.
Thank you, Amaya. And so finally, Jacopo, before Kian replies. Jacopo.
Yes, thank you, Marcia. Thank you, Kian, for this very interesting presentation, for giving us the possibility to read the paper. That is, to my view, a very good work. Excellent, I would say. A few key points. I agree with the other discussants that you correctly analyzed the problem of a not clear definition of justice, and also the interchangeably use of some terms like justice, equity, fairness in this field. So I totally agree with that. And also, I very much liked the idea to expand the scope of justice to beyond human beings, let's say. So, for example, asking questions like how should the suffering animals be impacted by climate change, and so on. And on other three main points on corrective justice. In your analysis, corrective justice, while morally significant, let's say, is it looks like a little bit less central. At least the description is shorter, and in my view, this is because corrective justice is like a well-known concept, maybe in your field, in the philosophy, but also in the economy. But also maybe because this concept tends to focus on compensation, which often steers political tension, particularly in the climate field, like historical emissions from industrialized nations. And so being so conflicting terms, maybe it would require a large description. So you probably correctly decided to skip that part. But this is my impression. So my question is if this impression is right or wrong. On the procedural justice, just a proposal is to incorporate citizen science into climate research as an innovative solution. So procedural justice could be, especially in climate science, accompanied by the idea that people, stakeholders could be involved in research, not only to collect data, but also in asking them how to do that. So involving them into the process to make the procedure more just. And then last point, I remember that you wrote that there are some elements which are missing in the climate justice framework, not in yours, but in general. Among them, two are particularly important. I was thinking about gender equality. It is not included at all in the shared socioeconomic pathways scenarios. And so my question is, how could we include this feature into the framework? And the other one is more about metrics, and there are the health indicators. Health indicators are there, but not sufficiently. You said that, I agree. And the Human Development Index, one of the main indicators, most famous, has one of the three elements based on health, but in climate research, these metrics, these indicators on health are quite neglected. So if you have any thoughts about that. And that's it. Thank you very much. Congratulations for your work.
Thank you, Jacopo, and to all discussants. Wonderful. So, Ian, the floor is again yours, guys.
Thanks, Marzia. And thank you to all the discussants. Thanks for reading and engaging with my work. I really appreciate that. So I'll go in order. So Philippe, so first you asked this question about distribution and whether, so I talked about scope as who is included, but you said we might be able to stratify who's included in various different ways. We might consider things like socioeconomic class and other characteristics. So I absolutely agree that that's a question of justice. The answer there is that well, obviously it depends on our data and how fine-grained they are. That's always a question. But supposing that we're able to, this is a question of justice because we might be able to see different things. We might be able to ask different questions when we stratify data in different populations in different ways. So that's where I see the justice aspect applying there. I don't include it in this concept, but I think you're right that it is implicit at that point. So I think that the question about utilitarianism as being or not being a pattern of justice is an important one. And we talked about this a lot. And I actually would say that utilitarianism is a shape of justice. It's a distributional, not procedure is not quite the right word, but consideration, but it's a distributional consideration which maximizes efficiency. And so the idea is that efficiency or not wasting resources or not wasting resources relative to utility or welfare generated, something like this is the goal. And so I agree that for most, if not all economists, that would be considered justice-free, but that's we're very much against that. That is a criterion, and it has certain value judgments behind it. Of course, historically speaking, if we go back to Bentham and Mill and the founders of the especially British form of utilitarianism, that was very much thought of as a ethical principle, and I would emphasize that. I think that is the correct way of thinking about it, even if it's less thought like that today.
Can I have just one word to be sure to fully understand? Do you mean that basically utilitarianism could be considered as in a justice perspective because basically it doesn't care about justice? So not caring about justice per se is talking about justice?
No, that's not the claim. I think it is a form of caring about justice, even though it's not usually discussed in that way. Caring about maximizing aggregate welfare or utility is a caring about people in a certain way. It's just not a way that's usually discussed by justice researchers. Another slightly different way of saying this is that most justice scholars think of prioritarianism as being a justice distribution, and utilitarianism is very similar to prioritarianism. It just doesn't have an extra concave transform. It's just unweighted. But it's if at the very least we can say if prioritarianism is a shape of justice, which most scholars think it is, then utilitarianism should be too. Okay, and then the last one was about how recognitional justice should be cultivated. And I thought that your point about trending topics is actually really good, and I hadn't thought of that before. I think that it is challenging. What you require is that there's human capital and certain kinds of training that are general in order to avoid it just being hijacked by various kinds of trending topics. And the solution to that is difficult because obviously we have different resources in terms of scientific training in different parts of the world across different groups and so forth. So it might be the case that it's easier to get this taken. So I don't think I have a specific answer, but I think that it is an interesting question about how to consider diversity in the context of certain kinds of disciplinary and scientific incentives. Amaya, so thanks for your questions. So you had a genealogical question about how the framework was built. So I have the advantage, together with my co-authors, of standing on the shoulders of giants, in the sense that many of these justice considerations have been discussed extensively in my home discipline of philosophy and in others. And so we were able to synthesize that. So very much the idea for me, when I was approaching it, was that the goal is to translate these complicated discussions in hopefully as streamlined a way as possible. So the goal of building it was more just streamlining what exists than selecting amongst it. But that leads to your second question, because some things were not amongst it. So you were asking whether which dimensions weren't included, and there are many. The one that I think is perhaps most relevant here is epistemic justice and injustice. So epistemic justice has to do with where justice comes into knowing. So an example of that is which concepts we have access to and then what we're able to explain. And the reason that's very influential in contemporary philosophy. The reason I didn't include it is because it was less obviously relevant to researchers. Now, it is relevant to policymakers and regulators, maybe more. But the idea there is that for researchers, most of the agents in the models are not fine-grained enough that they have information states and that kind of thing. So there isn't the right kind of specificity to make it relevant. But that's true amongst in the public, of course. Okay, so I know we got to get to the question. So sorry, Jacopo. So thanks again. So you had several questions again. So with corrective justice, you were asking why it's less central. That wasn't very intentional, but I think that you're right, that part of it was because it is fairly familiar to researchers. So we felt there was less time needed to explain. And there were only 2 points that we really wanted to make. So the one was, as I said, that it's responding to wrongdoing. There has to have been wrongdoing for corrective justice to apply. And then the second is that there are several categories, and you mentioned compensation, and we wanted to indicate that compensation is usually where we go, but it doesn't exhaust the ways we might correct a wrongdoing. So we wanted to get some of those ideas on the table. That's really the important thing for us. And once we'd said that, we thought the rest was maybe less important for most audiences here. With procedural justice, I think you're right that citizen science is a way of incorporating the public in ways that is more stakeholder engaged and more just for those reasons. And you asked how we can incorporate people better. I think the issue is being attentive to who's going to need this, in the scientific case, need those research outputs, and in the policy case, who is going to be affected. And so when it's clear to people that they're going to be affected, then maybe that'll help motivate them to be involved. Now, that's not always going to work, obviously, but I think that on the margin, it can be beneficial to try to bring people in those ways. And then you mentioned something about the elements missed in the picture. So part of the paper, which I didn't discuss in the presentation, is trying to systematically understand which of these have been looked at in SSP context in particular, socioeconomic pathway context in particular, but also other contexts of climate policy. I think that our goal there, we're not ambitious enough to be able to explain how those things should be incorporated, but we are pointing out that there are gaps, and that what's important to us is that things are made more robust, in the sense that if we were to change some of those justice assumptions, that researchers are aware that can change how evaluations work and be sensitive to those. So to leave some time for question, I'll stop there. Thank you again, all the commentators, for your excellent comments.
Thank you, Kian, and also for being so aware of timing. That's wonderful. Niccolò, any questions from the audience?
Yes, well, actually, we have so far 2 questions, so I invite all the other people in the audience to not be shy and express their questions about the justice. Maybe we can start by reporting the current two questions we have. One is from Christian, and he refers to the fact that the Climate Paris Agreement takes into consideration the principle of equity. It's mentioned in some of this article of the agreement. And he would like to, and he asked to Kian if he could perhaps elaborate on how countries or parties to this agreement are applying such an equity element in their nationally determined contribution when they implement the Paris Agreement. So I don't know if Kian, you followed the concrete, let's say, applications of theory of justice or equity principles about the Climate Paris Agreement, and if you can comment on this. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Christian. That's an excellent question. So you won't be surprised to hear that the answer is that it depends on which countries. But I can say a little bit more. Generally speaking, the justifications in the nationally determined contributions, NDCs, generally speaking, they have been, in my view, and I think this is true in the scholarly community more broadly, they've often been afterthoughts in the sense that certain politicians, certain countries, certain negotiation groups believe there are targets that they think are both sort of socially and politically feasible. And then they have sort of mostly, in my personal view, done justifications of those as a sort of a back end, backing out of what they think they can make. Now, I don't necessarily mean that as saying that they're not ambitious, but I think that specifically the justifications of their promises as equitable are often less weighty than the promises themselves. They spend a fair amount of time trying to figure out what's possible, and then a little bit of time trying to explain, at least publicly, why that's equitable. I'm happy to hear what other people think, but that's my personal view on it. And of course, it does vary from country to country. So there are some countries that have very sophisticated ideas about equity. For instance, they think about what's globally possible and then downscaling it to the national level on a per capita basis. That's fairly sophisticated, and you can, of course, be much more sophisticated than that. But I think that many countries aren't getting to that relatively low level of sophistication.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll stop there. Yeah,
Oh, you wanted to say something else on this question?
no, I was
Kian?
actually about to answer Albert, and then I realized it had
No, and then there is, well, actually, you can also read it as well, but Albert is asking, probably bringing back the issue of how these results are presented, are discussed, and how the conversation, let's say, about what is just, let the concept of what is just evolve over time. So he asked maybe practically, how do you think it would be good to involve policymakers in defining and doing research about climate justice? Please, Kian.
Thanks. And thanks for the excellent question, Albert. So I am, this is actually a really interesting and often overlooked issue. So as researchers, we have certain kinds of incentives and certain kind of guidance about what questions we think of as important. But we're often not very sensitive to what policymakers need, want, or would benefit from. And often it is at the level of, as I mentioned in the presentation, and as you say in your question, the handing over of the results. At that point, well, we say researchers say things like, here are some correlations, or here are some potential levers of action. Here are error bars. Here is the scope of what we're considering, and so forth. And then the policymaker is left saying, well, that's all well and good, but what I actually wanted to know was something different. And I think that is actually a real important problem. So part of the issue is institutional incentives, in the sense that researchers are incentivized to look for certain things, and those may or may not align with what policymakers are looking for at a given time. The second issue, and I'll list these and then I'll say a little bit about each of them. So one is institutional. The second is about competence. it might well be that researchers might be aware, but they just don't know how to investigate those particular issues, or they don't know how to discuss with the policymakers in order to figure out what that is. And I think actually that translation exercise is really important. Now, so let's take those in turn. So institutionally, most academic institutions are not really incentivized to connect very directly to policymakers. Even very sophisticated and influential institutions often, I'll tell you an anonymous anecdote. An English policymaker I knew, I was discussing this with her, and she said she went to a very top environmental research institute in the UK, where they boast about their policymaking expertise. And she said, but I've never heard any of you reach out to me. And she said this to me. And she was like, you're boasting about how policy relevant your research is, how useful it is, how impactful it is. And a lot of this would be useful to me, but I don't hear from it. And as a regulator, I don't have access to the academic journals. I'm not hearing about these articles. I can't access to them even if I hear about them in the news or something. So if that pathway isn't available, then it's not going to get where it needs to go. So what can be done about this? Well, I think that there are some institutions, obviously FSR, but others that are very, very interested in trying to bridge these divides. The institution that I work with, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IIASA, is actually funded by governments to do research on large-scale public policy, science to large-scale public policy problems. We're talking water, biodiversity, clean air, et cetera. So these kinds of institutes, I think, are important because they try to bridge these, but not all do, and many don't. How is that to be dealt with? I guess from a policymaking side, what's important to academics is that there is an impact, and that impact includes a policy impact. If there is that indication that there is interest in someone's research, most academics will respond positively, but it may take reaching out in that direction. If you're not at an institute like this. And then the second question is about how to communicate. And this is actually quite tricky because there's a lot of differences. So academics work on very long timescales, relatively slow. Policymakers work on very rapid timescales. And then, of course, there's content questions about what interests there are. Things that policymakers might be interested in might be academically not that interesting. They might not be novel. They might be replications of things that are already done, but for a new region or a new government or a new group. Academically speaking, there isn't much advantage to this. It's about new methods. It's not about reusing things that are familiar. So those kinds of things are challenges. But the flip side of that is that when things are familiar and those methods are known, then they can be done relatively straightforwardly. So that's something that can be an advantage, even if scientifically they're less interesting. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Kian, also on this reflection, let's say, on the role of researchers, academics, and sometimes the conflicting interests, because academics, as you said, basically can work for different audiences, and sometimes this work is very different, and maybe what you do for one audience is irrelevant for the other. So there is inevitably a trade-off. Well, we have another question. Kevin, well, it's not a question, it's more, I'm reading. Oh, it's very long. But it's more to show.
Yeah, it's more of a comment.
It's more
Yes.
a comment
Yes.
to the question, so not fully relevant. Maybe if there are no other questions from the audience, then we can go back to Philippe, because Philippe, you seem to be willing to raise other questions earlier when you were speaking. I don't know if you still have something to ask to Kian after this conversation.
I could talk for hours anyway. So.
Well, you have 5 minutes.
Yeah, just two quick thoughts about this topic. The first one is that about the dynamics of those considerations of justice, meaning that since a few years there is a growing consideration on economic justice, like tax the rich movements and things like that. So it's a general concept. I'm wondering if in the second part of the research that has been performed in the paper, is this trend also applied to climate research? A second point related to that is a growing importance given to adaptation as regard to mitigation. And here I have the same type of question, in the sense that, well, mitigation options have some impacts on inequalities and on justice. But adaptation also has a lot of those type of impacts, and they are not the same. So I would be curious to see, like, if the rise of adaptation issues over the past few years changed the pattern of justice consideration in climate research. And my final point is about integrated assessment models, which are very important in our field. And my guess is that there is a strong past dependency to those models. And the fact that when you have some new topics that emerge or that rise, maybe it's difficult, maybe it's a barrier to the development of those new issues and of the issues of social justice topics, because those models were not built for that purpose. And so the question that I'm asking is, what's the right strategy? That's starting from scratch, building new models that comprehensively take into account justice issues, or adapt the tools that are already in place but that are not made for that type of purpose. So that was my 3 comments or question.
Yeah, thanks for those. Those are all great points. So let me take them in this order. So first, adaptation versus mitigation. So as you rightly say, a focus on adaptation generates different kinds of distributional implications. So one basic point is that mitigation is, to a first approximation, global and international, and at a first approximation, adaptation is very local. The benefits are highly local. So that's an example. And as a corollary, generally speaking, wealthier regional communities will be more able to adapt and therefore able to protect themselves better. And similarly, they will be able to both protect themselves and therefore reduce the impacts of failed mitigation in a way that's not true for less developed regions. So the question is, do I see this in the research? We did this sort of literature review of the scenario research. The answer is only to a very limited extent. I don't think that those kinds of distributional inequalities that result from a focus on adaptation towards mitigation, they're understood at that sort of wide, high level, but in terms of the actual research that's being done, I think less is focused on those distributional justice distinctions between them, let's say. So I think that that's really wide, there's a wide research gap or scope for discussion there. The last question was about path dependency and IAMs. So I'm very interested in IAMs. I did my doctoral work on ethical issues involved in integrated assessment models, and I've written a little bit about them. I think that when we're talking about what can be done, I think you're absolutely right that saying that justice considerations are important and therefore we should build our models around them would entail a large amount of work, would entail perhaps reworking things that have been done and that are quite well developed. And so, and I think the benefits would not necessarily be commensurate with the person hours. That being said, I'm actually working with some IAM modelers right now on exactly this question, discussing how well IAMs can incorporate this particular framework in particular. And basically, we think that some of the things are quite easy to introduce. Obviously, distributional is very fundamental to IAMs, and you can easily add these different structures, different theories of justice. And to some extent, you can add corrective justice in there without too much effort. Our view is that other things are sort of exogenous to the models, basically. So things like recognitional justice, things like procedural justice are questions that are for the modeler as opposed to endogenous to a model. So it's not necessarily a problem that they're not easy to incorporate, because at some level they're operating at a different level of explanatory matter in the science. So again, that's sort of in progress, and we're fairly early actually in that process, but we're specifically looking at that question right now. I think we're coming towards time, so maybe I should stop there. Thanks for the questions.
Yes. Thank you, Kian, very much. And thank you all for being part of the discussion. We've come to an end. So Kian, thank you for sharing ideas and an extremely interesting work that you are doing. Thank you, Philippe, Amaya, Jacopo, for being such brilliant discussants. Niccolo and I look forward to reconnecting with our audience in our next FSR Insights on November 20th, which is going to explore capacity mechanism. And the insight is called Allowing Explicit Participation in Capacity Mechanism, an Improvement or a Failed Scope. So with Emma Menegatti, one of our researchers, and you will be soon able to register online for the webinar on our website. Have a great day.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.